Okay, and that's very consistent with what we learned last week. So absolutely, very appropriate. Dennis, do you have anything you wanted to share right now? No? Okay. Doesn't look like he's speaking.
Okay.
Okay. Who in here would like to share? Yes, ma'am.
The traditional doctrine of the Trinity suggests polytheism, but they accepted the threefold nature of God, a trinity of life, truth, and love. God the Father, Mother, Christ's spiritual idea of sonship, and divine science, or the Holy Comforter. And salvation is life, truth, and love understood and demonstrated as a supreme over all. Sin, sickness, death are destroyed. Heaven and hell are states of mind.
And who said that?
This was in their statement of faith.
Whose statement of faith?
Mary Baker Eddy.
Okay. Very good. And all of that is, it sounds very deep, and that's interesting. Okay, good.
Well, it's interesting to us because, well, for Dean and me, because his side of the family were Christian side, and how he became a believer out of that is interesting.
Indeed. Who else?
Are you looking for a scientist that is a Christian?
Right. Right.
Well, I didn't do it, but I've always liked Ken Ham, and his statement all the time was, "Were you there?" For every time, you know, in evolution, were you there? So I don't know if that fits or doesn't fit.
No, it's absolutely, absolutely. One of the things that he wasn't a scientist, but R.C. Sproul, one of my favorite things from him is, well, you know, I forget what the term is, but you know that an object is at rest, tends to stay at rest, and an object that's in motion it tends to stay in motion. And so he says, well, if there was the Big Bang, well, who moved?
Right.
I love that. It's just, you just ask, well, who moved?
Right.
You know? But he wasn't a scientist. But you know, to put that in perspective. Anyway, who else? Anybody?
I've been reading some headlines online, which is a terrible place to be, that we're having an awful lot of babies with an extra vein in their arm. So now we are in microevolution. That's the theory. So we are involved.
An extra vein?
An extra vein.
Heard that.
That's what they're saying. I heard that too. Something else. Some other.
Well, it
Something else.
It happens all the time because Daddy had an extra vein in his heart, which kept him from dying. Whenever they did open heart surgery on him, they didn't know why he was still living, but God had graciously rerouted the blood supply. So, you know.
Interesting. Okay.
My mother had one. She told me what it was yesterday. We were working, and I don't remember. She's not feeling well, so.
Okay, that's why they're out here.
Yeah, but she had somebody, and I can't remember who it was. So.
Will you be seeing them this week?
Probably.
Can you get that to me?
Yeah. Sure.
And just speak of that, I have an extra vertebrae in my back, which I found out several years ago from a chiropractor. I'm one vertebrae taller than I should be.
So you're evolving.
So I'm evolving.
You're evolving.
And it didn't help a whole lot, did it?
Right before our eyes.
So I needed a few more to stretch up the back, you know.
Oh, goodness.
Shaker has a little book out called He Is There and He Is Not Silent. And it's only about 100 pages. It looks like an easy read. It takes like 3 weeks to read it. But he talks about this very thing, about trying to make a comprehensive worldview from within a closed system. And that's what evolution is. Since you deny God, you come up with this thing which has no existence, and that's the creative force. It's a good book if you ever want to punish yourself.
Right. Did anybody do anything about eugenics, and does anybody know anything about the connection there?
Yeah, I have. I have. Hey, just a definition of it. Let me just read what a definition is. And it's actually from the Greek. which means good and come into being growing. But it's a set of beliefs and practices that aim to improve the genetic quality of human population historically by excluding people and groups judged to be inferior or promoting those judged to be superior. So eugenics has as some of its manifestations things like the genetic engineering that they try to do by taking the sperm and the eggs of people who are intelligent and trying to put them together so that they guarantee that the offspring of those people are intelligent or good looking or blue eyes or blonde hair or anything like that. That's led to that, but it's also led to abortion. And at one time it was, and probably the thing that we hear most of that it is talked about is sterilization, that they would sterilize those that they did not think should have children. And so it's just the whole, and Planned Parenthood comes out of the whole eugenics type of belief system.
Margaret Sanger, yes.
Margaret Sanger. Iceland and Denmark are right now in the phase. Their posture is to kill any Down syndrome child that they recognize. And so every pregnant woman in those countries has to be tested. Everyone has to be tested. And if you have a Down syndrome chromosome, you have a Down syndrome baby, they will encourage you to kill it right then and there. And if you go against the state, they'll punish it. So that's Iceland. Iceland's bragging right now that they have no Down syndrome problem at all.
Oh, they do. It's just in a very different place. Right?
They have no Down syndrome problem at all. That's the policy.
I find it interesting, you know, kind of universally, Adolf Hitler is the epitome of evil. He was all of that. He wasn't a madman. He came from a thought system of that. I mean, he is the Aryan race. You know, he was an evolutionist and all that. All those, we're going into the same thinking of Adolf Hitler. You know, and he's considered a man, you know, nuts. And, no, he wasn't. He was a product of what he thought. And he acted on it. And, you know, I always picture at school, you know, you'd see Europe and you'd see that black, you know, blob going across Europe, you know, always that. It was always black. It was never, you know, a bright yellow or something, you know, it was, this evil is just going over. We're doing the same thing.
But in the US now, the policy is if you have twins and you don't want twins, you can ethically kill it now. That's going on in the US right now.
Oh,
it's called
pregnancy.
It's called pregnancy selection and pregnancy reduction. So let's say you have triplets and you say, I don't really want triplets. I think I'll just keep the twins. So the doctor has can go in and just pick it random. How about this one?
It's going to lose the lottery.
So that's going on right now in the US.
Linda, you were going to say something?
I looked it up concerning the minimum wage, but I didn't really understand it. It says, you know, it was part of the eugenics strategy to engineer a master race through public policy designed to cleanse the citizenship of undesirables. But I didn't quite understand that because minimum wage is like, that's the minimum that an employer can pay you.
Right.
I didn't really understand the relationship. Maybe explain that better.
So this is very important to bear in mind as people are sitting here screaming for, hey, we need a $15 minimum wage. Well, why not $100 minimum wage? Why not $1,000? You know, what is the number? So and all of this came about as the great, you know, the Enlightenment of the 19th century, and everything that came out of that, Nazi Germany being one of them in its, you know, this is the logical conclusion of these things and these thoughts. And so this was the era when we had people arguing for the direct election of senators, US senators. Well, that's completely outside of the realm of what was designed in through the checks and balances and so forth of the states against the federal government that the founders had in mind. This was the era with Wilson. I encourage you to go look at some of his thoughts on things, even though he was Presbyterian. Well, he very much was changing, you know, it was part of that very progressive movement in that era. And other things that went on. But with regard specifically to minimum wage and eugenics, the idea was we are going to set a minimum wage that is so high, because it used to be with an open market, free market economy. If I want to pay you, if I think your job is worth 10 cents an hour to sweep the floor at a shop or something, whatever, and that's what I'm willing to pay you, that's what the market's willing to bear, then I'm going to pay you 10 cents an hour to do that. And there's going to only be a certain number of people who have that mental capacity that that's all that they can probably do. Maybe somebody with Down syndrome, for example, right? To try to tie that in. So that's all that maybe they're capable of doing, or very little. And we're going to pay them 10 cents an hour. Well, now the government's going to come in and say, no, you're going to pay the minimum wage is going to be $1 an hour. Well, I can't pay you $1 an hour to sweep the floor because you're only worth 10 cents an hour. So therefore, the theory with setting the minimum wage at a rate, and it being dictated by the federal government, by the way, ties to the eugenics process, because the theory was, if we set the minimum wage so high, then these people will eventually die out because they will starve to death. The logic of, take that to its logical conclusion, these people will die, and therefore they won't be procreating, they won't be around anymore. So it's for purging the unwanted from society.
Yeah.
So
but in a capitalist system, labor is a commodity in itself.
This is true. This is true.
That's interesting to hear, because when I had my first job, the minimum wage was 85 cents an hour. And it was explained to us at the time that it was so that students were not getting ripped off by being paid like they had been paying for child labor and different things during the years, and child labor laws had a lot to do with the minimum wage. So I don't know how those two things, you know, if there's one side that says the minimum wage has to be there to protect against child labor and taking advantage of child labor, or what, you know, 85 cents, and it was not considered at what we were talking about when I was a teenager. It wasn't considered a living wage. It was a minimum wage that you would pay somebody in a fast food restaurant, which is what I did. But it was so that they couldn't just pay 10 cents an hour there, but they, but it sort of grew out of the whole idea of, for some people, it grew out of the idea of, you know, here's these kids that were going into the factories working for next to nothing, and this is to protect somewhat from that too. So you know, there's good and bad to a lot of things, but I think now they talk about minimum wage, like Walmart says, our minimum wage is now what, $11, $12 or whatever. That's their starting wage. That's not minimum wage. But yet, you know, we've gotten into a situation where the way we say it is different. So now all these companies have to come out and say, well, our minimum wage is this, rather than our starting wage.
Okay. All right. Any questions, thoughts, comments?
Well, I thought that was interesting what you said about it. I thought it in the opposite way. Because I think actually Star Trek had an episode of this, but if you can,
I'm a Trekkie.
Yeah, oh yeah, I think so. I think this is an original episode too, but I think too, if you can engineer kind of the super, you can also engineer grunts. I need a war fought. Let's engineer some expendables. you know, we can send them out to the front line.
Sure.
We just need things assembled. Let's make them dumb.
Aldous Huxley's Brave New World.
Yeah.
Mustafa Aman, the chief world predestinator, right?
Yeah.
You hear that all the time about the Democratic Party needing, you know, all the people to stay on welfare and to stay on this government assistance,
Yeah.
so they'll keep voting, because you do always need the underclass, or
And
somebody always needs the underclass.
They need a permanent underclass that's reliant.
And if there isn't one, they'll make one. They'll tell you you're being oppressed.
Like the important one.
Yeah.
Put it on that wall.
Right.
All right, so we've spent a lot of time on our homework.
Back to Schaefer.
So, yeah, and who has their Bibles with them today? Okay. So go ahead and start the video there, Dennis.
Okay, just let me make sure that you tell me if you're getting the sound, okay?
Okay. Yeah.
The history of the non-Christian philosophers up until the 18th century went like this. Here is a circle which stands for what the unified and true knowledge of the universe is. Then the next man would say no and cross out the circle. But he then would say, here is the circle. And the next man would say no and cross out that circle. Then he would make his circle. And the next man would cross it out and make his circle. This continued through the centuries. They never found the circle, but they optimistically believed someone would, beginning only from man himself and on the basis of man's reasoning alone. Then the endless row of circles through the centuries and the crossing out were broken. And a drastic shift came because the humanistic ideal had failed. Humanistic man gave up his optimism for pessimism. He gave up the hope of a unified answer. And this makes modern man who he is. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, philosopher from Geneva. He lived in the 18th century. He thought primitive man, the noble savage, to be superior to civilized man. He felt that the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, the arts and the sciences, caused man to lose more than he gained. Rousseau saw the constraints of civilization as evils.
L'homme est né libre, et cependant, partout il est dans les fers.
Man was born free, but everywhere he is in chains. He demanded not just freedom from God or the Bible, but freedom from any kind of restraint. Freedom from culture, freedom from authority, absolute freedom for the individual, with the individual at the center of the universe. When applied to the individual, his concept led to the bohemian ideal, where the hero was the man who fought all standards and all values and all restraints of society. When Rousseau applied his concept of autonomous freedom to society, his concept would not function. Whosoever refuses to obey the general will shall be compelled to do so by the whole body. Rousseau wrote this in 1762. This means nothing less than that he will be forced to be free. In other words, tyranny. A tyranny that carried his position to its logical conclusion in the reign of terror of the French Revolution. Robespierre, the king of the terror, genuinely saw himself putting Rousseau's ideas into practice. Paul Gauguin was a follower of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In his hunt for total freedom, he deserted his family. He went to Tahiti, hoping to find there the noble savage. And there he found the ideal of the noble savage to be an illusion. As he worked on this painting, he also wrote about it. He called it a philosophical work comparable to the gospel. But what a gospel. Gauguin himself said,
"Close to the death of an old woman, a strange, stupid bird concludes. Whence? What? Whither? O sorrow, thou art my master. Fate, how cruel thou art, and always vanquished. I revolt."
What he found in Tahiti was death and cruelty. The man is good by nature, as Rousseau claimed, is no more true a primitive man than a civilized man. When Gauguin finished this painting, he tried to commit suicide, but he did not succeed. There was one man who well understood the logical conclusion of the deification of nature, the Marquis de Sade. If nature is all, then what is right, and nothing more can be said. As nature has made us, the men, the strongest we can do with her, the woman, whatever we please. The inevitable result was his cruelty to women. Thus, there was no basis for either morals or law. Let me dwell for a moment on the Dutch Reformation painters, who so rejoicingly painted the simple things of life. They knew that nature was created by a personal and a good God. But they also knew, because of the fall, man's revolt against God, that nature as it is now is abnormal. That is a very different thing than taking nature as it is now and making it the measure of goodness. Because when this is done, there is no difference between cruelty and non-cruelty. Even at the time of Rousseau and his followers, the two concepts of total freedom and of everything, including man, being part of one big machine, could no longer be kept together. Rousseau's position of man's total freedom collides with the position that on the basis of man's reason alone, everything, including man, is part of one big machine. The two positions just couldn't be kept united. Later, the German philosophers Immanuel Kant and George Wilhelm Hegel and the Danish Søren Kierkegaard wrestled with the problem of a unity of reason on one hand, and on the other hand, meaning and values. But they did not solve the problem. Humanistic man, beginning only from himself, has concluded that he is only a machine. Humanistic man has no place for a personal God, but there is also no place for man's significance as man, no place for love, no place for freedom. Man is only a machine. But the men who hold this position could not and cannot live like machines. If they could, modern man would not have his tensions, either in his intellectual position or in his life. But he can. And so they must leap away from reason to try to find something which gives meaning to their lives, to life itself, even though to do so, they deny their reason. Once this is done, any type of thing could be put there, because in the area of non-reason, reason gives no basis for a choice. This is the hallmark of modern man. How did it happen? It happened because proud, humanistic man, though he was finite, insisted in beginning only from himself and from what he could learn without other knowledge. He did not succeed. Perhaps the best known of the existential philosophers was Jean-Paul Sartre. He used to spend much time here in Paris at the Durmago. His position is that in the area of reason, everything is absurd, but that one can authenticate himself, that is, give validity to his existence by an act of the will. With Sartre's position, one can equally help an old woman across the street.
Merci, monsieur. Oh, ben, vous savez de nos jours, hein? Merci, monsieur. Merci beaucoup.
Or run her down. Reason was not involved, and there was nothing to show the direction that this authentication by an act of the will should take. But Sartre himself could not live consistently with his own position.
Adressé au président du tribunal international pour les crimes de guerre par le président Ho Chi Minh.
At a certain point, he signed the Algerian Manifesto, which declared that the Algerian war was a dirty war. This action meant man could use his reason to decide some things were right and some things were wrong, and so he destroyed his own system.
Au moment où les impérialistes américains intensifient à outrance l'escalade.
Karl Jaspers, a German existentialist, tended to have the greatest impact on the thought and life form which followed existential thought. According to him, we may have some huge experience, which gives us the hope that perhaps there is a meaning to life, even though our reason tells us that life is absurd. He calls this a final experience. Martin Heidegger was another existential philosopher who said that the answer was in the area of non-reason. The German philosopher said there is something he called angst, a general feeling of anxiety one feels in the universe. This feeling, this mood of anxiety, revealed existence, and this imposes on us a call for decision. Out of this mood comes meaning to life and to choice, even against one's reason. Meaning which rests on nothing more than this vague feeling of anxiety, so nebulous it doesn't even have a specific object. As Martin Heidegger grew older, this view became too weak for him, so he changed his position. Existentialism as a form of philosophy has all but disappeared, but more and more people are thinking this way, even if they do not know the name existentialism. To them, reason leads to pessimism, and so they try to find an answer in something totally separated from reason. Aldous Huxley, the English philosopher and writer, proposed drugs as a solution. According to him, we should give drugs to healthy people. By means of the drug experience, they could then find truth inside their own heads anytime they wished. What was left for Huxley and his followers was truth inside man's own head. To them, objective truth was gone. The drug culture and the mentality that went with it had its own vehicle which crossed the frontiers of the world, which were otherwise almost impassable by other means of communication. This record became the rallying cry of many of the young people throughout the whole world. It expressed the essence of their lives, their thoughts, and their feelings.
Later came psychedelic rock, an attempt to find this experience without drugs. The younger people and the older ones tried drug taking, but then turned to the Eastern religions. Both drugs and the Eastern religions seek truth inside one's own head, in negation of reason. The central reason for the popularity of Eastern religions in the West is a hope for non-rational meaning to life and values.
The reason young people turn to the Eastern religions and so on is simply the fact, as we have said, and that is that man having moved into the area of non-reason, you can put anything up there. And the heart of the Eastern religion is a denial of reason, just exactly as the idealistic drug taking was. And so the turning to the Eastern religions today fits exactly into the modern existential methodology, the existential thinking of modern man, of trying to find some optimistic hope in the area of non-reason when he's given up hope on a humanistic basis of finding any kind of unifying answer to life, any meaning to life in the answer of reason.
Though demons do not fit into modern man's conclusions on the basis of his reason, many modern people feel that even demons are better than everything in the universe, being only one big machine. People put the occult in the area of non-reason, in the hope of some kind of meaning, even if it is a horrendous kind of meaning.
One must feel as a Christian a real sorrow for these people. But as far as the blame is concerned, we must understand these people who have turned to this are not to blame. They must bear their own kind of blame of individual choices, but basically they're not to blame. The church is to blame, because the church with its liberal theology has left a vacuum.
Man, beginning from himself alone, was now expressed and taught in theology and in theological language. In the Renaissance, men had attempted to mix Aristotle and Plato with Christianity. This new theology was an attempt to combine the rationalism of the Enlightenment with Christianity. It is often called religious liberalism. It was embarrassed by the supernatural and often denied it entirely. For example, the resurrection of Christ from the dead. But it tried to hold on to a historical Jesus by sifting out from the New Testament all those supernatural elements which the New Testament taught about Jesus. This attempt came to a climax with Albert Schweitzer's famous book, Quest of the Historical Jesus. It failed. It failed to rid the New Testament account of the supernatural and still keep an historic Christ. The historic Jesus could not be separated from the supernatural events connected with him in the New Testament. History and the supernatural are too interwoven in the New Testament. If one kept any of the historical Jesus, one had to keep some of the supernatural. If one got rid of all the supernatural, one had no historical Jesus.
should remember Schweitzer's humanitarianism in Africa, his genius as an organist, and his expertise concerning Bach. But unhappily, we must remember his place in the theological stream as well.
After the failure of the older theological liberalism, Karl Barth stepped into the vacuum. He held the higher critical views concerning the Bible. That is, that the Bible has many mistakes. But he taught that a religious word could break through from it. This was the theological form of existentialism after existentialism had been accepted in its secular form. Thus, one more thing was added to the area of non-reason, along with all the other things that had been put there. In another way, we must have admiration for the Swiss Karl Barth, because while he was teaching in Germany, he spoke out clearly against Nazism in his Barmen Declaration of 1934. The teaching of Barth led to those theologians who said that the Bible isn't true in the areas of science and history, but they nevertheless looked for a religious experience from it. And for many adherents of this theology, the Bible does not give absolutes in regard to what is right or wrong either.
Before you even come to the Bible and begin to read it, one must realize there are two ways to read the Bible. One is just one more religious thing among thousands of other religious things, which really are nothing more than another form of trip, not very, very different actually from a drug trip. The other way is to understand that the Bible is truth. And as such, what we're listening to is something that is completely contrary to what we hear about us on every side, namely merely statistical averages, relativistic things. Now, having said this, then I'd have to guard myself for the simple reason that it doesn't mean a person has to believe all this before he can begin to read the Bible and find truth in the Bible. I would just say in passing, I was not raised in a Christian family, and I was reading much philosophy when I was a young man, and I didn't read the Bible because I believed it was true. I read it just simply out of an intellectual honesty. But I did do one thing. I read it exactly the way it was written. Beginning with Genesis 1:1 and going right on, I read it the same way I would read another book, expecting that what was being given was a straightforward statement of what was meant, and that it wasn't to be read in a different level than I would read in the area of another kind of book. And as I read it, it answered the questions which already by that time I realized that humanistic philosophy couldn't answer. And over a 6-month period, I came to conclude that it was truth. But nevertheless, we must keep in the back of our mind, how are we reading the Bible? Just as another religious trip? Or am I really wrestling with the question of what it's given in all the areas of which it speaks? Is this truth and compared to merely relativism?
The new liberal theologian has no answer for the existence of evil, and thus they're left with the same problem as the Hindu philosophers. Everything that is a part of God. This is Kali, the Eastern Hindu feminine representation of God. Why the fangs and the skulls? In Eastern religious thought, cruelty is ultimately the same as non-cruelty, because everything that now is part of that which has always been, a part of what they call God. Modern humanistic man has come to the same awful place, a place in which it is not possible to know what is right and what is wrong, nor why we should choose non-cruelty rather than cruelty. Professor Paul Tillich of Harvard was one of the outstanding neo-Orthodox liberal theologians. A student who was present told me that when Professor Tillich was lecturing in Santa Barbara just before his death, someone said to him, "Sir, do you pray?" And he said, "No, but I meditate." He was left only with the word God, with no certainty that there was anything more than just a word. The God is dead theologians, which followed Tillich,
concluded logically that if they are only left with the word God, they might as well cross out the word. But for these theologians, even if they do not say God is dead, for them certain things are dead. All content about God is dead, and all assurance of knowledge about a personal God is dead. Because for them, God has not given to people truth about himself in the Bible and in the revelation in Christ. That is, truth about himself which may be expressed in propositions in normal language. All they're left with is religious words without content, but with that emotion that certain religious words still brings with them, and that is all. And here is what comes next. These highly motivational religious words out of our religious past, but separated from the content which the Bible originally gave them, are now used for manipulation. Manipulation in such areas as a change in sexual ethic, but also legal and political manipulation. If God is dead, if content about God is dead, if the knowledge of a personal God who has not been silent but has given us truth is dead, then everything for which God gives an answer and meaning is dead as well. And yet, people, no matter who they say they are, cry out for meaning and values. And this place of tension is where modern man has come upon his humanist base. And this is where he is. When we think of Christ, of course we think of his substitutionary death upon the cross. When he who claimed to be God died in a substitutionary way. And as such, his death had infinite value. And as we accept that gift, raising the empty hands of faith and accepting it with no humanistic elements, we have that which is real life, and that is in being in relationship to the infinite personal God who is there, and in being in a personal relationship to him. But Christ brings life in another way that often is not as clearly thought about, perhaps, and that is that he connects himself with what the Bible teaches in his teaching. And as such, he is a prophet as well as a savior. And it's upon the basis of what he taught and the Bible teaches, because he himself wraps these together, that we have life instead of death, in the sense of having some knowledge that is more than man can have from himself, beginning from himself alone. Both of these elements are the place where Christ gives us life.
I'm going to start our discussion on this section, which I think really probably would have been good for him to start with. But we talked last week about what is that we learned from our catechism, what is the chief end of man, but to glorify God and fully to enjoy him forever. So if that is the chief end of man for the Christian, then what is the chief end of man for the humanist? And himself. Exactly. Man is the measure of all things. That if man is the measure of all things, therefore we can go all of these things. Man is the measure of all things, and then ultimately, where does it get us? But there's no difference between right and wrong. What is right. And then what was the other thing? Reason will therefore lead to pessimism. We have no choice. Ultimately, this is where it all ties in. So I spent way too much time on the homework section this morning. I apologize for that. So we had missed out on a lot of discussion. We had some Bible verses that I had handed out about adding to scripture, which kind of ties to our homework actually. So we're adding things to scripture. I do want to call out one thing here, that if God is dead, who said that incidentally? God is dead. Huh? No, not to say he didn't say it, but who's?
Oh, that was the Beatles. That was a famous thing the Beatles said in the 60s. There's a whole
Nietzsche,
movement.
Friedrich
You
Nietzsche.
weren't here yet, but that.
Well, this predated the Beatles by like 100 years. So yeah, anyway.
I thought that's where you're going.
But anyway, so Fyodor
Dostoevsky,
Dostoevsky, he said that if God is dead, obviously flowing out of Nietzsche, if God is dead, then all things are permissible. So remember the old woman getting run over. Well, all things are permissible. I helped her across the street, and then she goes another block and somebody runs her down because, well, you know, all things are permissible at the end of the day, right? So as we think about society today, so, and, you know, relativism and everything, well, it's, you know, well, I think it's okay. I'm going to help this lady across the street. And, you know, Craig says, well, I'm going to run her down because, well, that's good too, you know? And, you know, I mean, I'm just driving my old Ford Ranger anyway. It's not going to hurt it any. So, you know.
I don't know about that. I'm not going to do it.
But there's no difference between right and wrong, and what is right. And you think about the animal kingdom. Well, you know, it's so nice. You see this, you know, you see on the nature channels or whatever with the what do they call the thing they jump around and then they get attacked by some lions or something.
Gazelles.
Gazelles. You see those gazelles. Oh, look how graceful they are, and everything. And here's this lion comes and they have to eat, and so it's right, you know. What's to say that they, I mean, you know, what's to say that they can't attack that gazelle or whatever? So, you know, and I think about a few years back, we had there was a video, somebody had set up a camera, y'all might remember it. I want to say it was in Pennsylvania or something. So they had set up a camera in a bald eagle's nest, and they set this thing up so that they could see, you remember this? They could see the nest and the baby eagles. And
Minnesota.
Was it in Minnesota? Well, wherever it was. And anyway, so then you know, they streamed it to schools so that they could dial in and see, you know, what's going on in the eagle's nest. And then here comes Mama Eagle with a kitten, and they're all pecking and eating this kitten, and you know, terrifying these kids that, you know, well, I mean, if what's right is what is right, right? Yeah, exactly, right.
That was my cat. Oh my God.
So, but what's to say? I mean, why isn't that cat anything different than a gazelle, or why wouldn't it be a small child? What's the difference? You know, at the end of the day, you know. So anyway, but your homework is, how has philosophy, as described in this chapter? So I want to keep it in the context of the humanist philosophy. So there are good things that we talked about a couple of weeks ago with some logical things that of Plato and Aristotle that the Christian church adopted, and some of that wasn't necessarily bad. So having reason and logic and being able to argue, you know, with debating and so forth, and this is all, these are good things, right? And I would argue that God has given us as sentient human beings that can think. But that was a good thing. But then we want to talk about the humanist side here. So how has philosophy infiltrated the church? And you can kind of see this in, I want to say they talk a little bit about Unitarianism somewhere in the reading, I guess, but I don't know, maybe I've grafted that in and slept since then.
I got a book for you.
You know, but that's from the Enlightenment, you know, well, what, you know, that's a good example of some of the logic, right? So be thinking about that, but that's the homework. How has philosophy infiltrated the church? Okay. Does anybody have any closing comments?
That could be a term paper.
It really could. So kind of think about bullet points. We don't want a dissertation, but just think about bullet points and things to kind of share. And even within our own church. So I mentioned Wilson earlier, and he was an ardent Presbyterian. But you know, think about within our own church or our own denomination. The Catholic Church, I would argue, prior to the Reformation and some of the things that were brought up, these are areas that you can kind of look in history and kind of see where did this kind of philosophy infiltrate the church. So, you know,
It's in Pope Francis.
John has a bone to pick with Pope Francis.
Well, no, it's a book that's been written about him and his specific philosophies.
Oh, okay.
And it's called The Throwaway Culture. Don't get involved in the throwaway culture. And it's written by a Catholic about specifically the encyclicals of Francis. He is the embodiment of most of those people that are listed right there.
Oh, really? Yeah, he was a pope. When did
Well,
Pope Francis?
He's right now.
Right now, okay. Oh.
He's big into liberation theology, social gospel.
He's the.
Well, he came from
Because he's a South American.
Exactly.
He's the embodiment of what you're looking at right
He's
here.
an Argentine.
This is what he's teaching the Catholic Church today, right now.
But is he speaking at what's it called, from the
Ex-cathedral.
Ex-cathedra? Is that it? No.
Oh, ex-cathedra.
Yeah.
But that's not true. He only speaks ex-cathedra when he sits on the throne and makes a statement.
Exactly. So that's what
The
I'm
rest
saying.
of it's opinion.
Right.
But when he sits on the throne, he can overrule scripture.
So is he speaking from that
He
perspective?
speaks
Or?
that today. This is what he's speaking today.
Right.
Because he is a South American social injustice.
Liberation
theology. He's got it all.
And
we
Marxism
don't
is
know
all
who
of
he
it.
is.
Viva la
Telling you, this is what she's being taught.
But this is what he's teaching right now. This is everything he's teaching in his encyclicals today.
Would somebody like to close this in prayer? And definitely think about that. Bring that as part of your homework.
Yeah,
That's
oh my
important.
gosh, I'll just bring the whole book.
Would somebody like to close us in prayer?
Lord, this makes me think of Paul. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. And that we need to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. And just how important this subject of philosophy that a lot of people just like to, not think about and that. But we're impacted so much by thought. And we pray that you would help us to sharpen our thoughts and the anvil and the grinding wheel, we put that on the scripture. It hurts. I would imagine the grinding wheel would hurt. And we pray though that we would endure and that you would see us to the end because you promised to do so. Help us to tell others about Christ and may we grow in grace in Christ's name. Amen.
Thank you, folks. Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Craig.
Jordan, we're on for Craig.
Okay, everybody's going away.
Bye.